He bought a forgotten cabin for just $1, but what he found inside uncovered a secret buried for decades. A loyal German shepherd, a hidden box of letters, and a truth powerful enough to destroy a man's soul. This is the story of redemption, love, and the miracle of second chances. Before I get started on his journey, please take a few seconds to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Where are you watching tonight? Chapter 1. The Man and the Forgotten Cabin. The morning sky over Montana was pale and brittle, the kind of cold light that made even the mountains look tired. Tom Walker pulled his old denim jacket tighter around his shoulders as he stood outside the county courthouse. He was 58, tall but slightly hunched, his back bent by decades of labor under heavy engines and heavier burdens. His beard was streaked with gray, the kind that came more from worry than age. His eyes, a washed-out blue, held a stillness that spoke of loss rather than peace. Tom had the look of a man who'd worked hard his whole life and hadn't yet figured out what it was all for. 6 years had passed since his wife Helen died of cancer. In that time, the laughter had left his voice, and the house they once shared had become more like a tomb, clean, quiet, and empty. He still spoke to her sometimes, in the way lonely men do, soft words over morning coffee, half believing she might answer. When she didn't, the silence pressed against him like a physical thing. His only company now was Max, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat and an intelligent gaze that missed nothing. Max had a noble posture, chest broad, ears alert, and a faint gray mask around his muzzle that gave him the look of a weary old soldier. Tom had found him 3 winters ago, half-starved and shivering behind the workshop. Since that night, Max had followed him everywhere. They had a wordless understanding, 2 souls surviving by routine, protecting each other from the emptiness that threatened to creep in. Inside the courthouse, the auction room was small and smelled faintly of paper, dust, and the ghost of old tobacco. About 15 townsfolk stood scattered around the wooden benches, boots muddy from the thawing snow. The auctioneer, Curtis Bell, a gaunt man with thinning hair and a nervous habit of licking his lips, stood at the front behind a makeshift podium. Curtis was known for his efficiency, but his eyes darted around the room now, uneasy. "Next item," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Lot 14, 12 acres, 1 cabin, Birch Hollow Road, opening bid, $1. The room went still. No one spoke, no one moved. It was a silence with weight, the kind that came when people knew something you didn't. Tom frowned and glanced around. There was Earl Danner, the feed store owner, a stout man with red cheeks and a perpetual smell of hay. He usually had something to say about every piece of land that came up for sale, but now he kept his head down, eyes fixed on the floor. Beside him stood Maggie O'Neill, a wiry widow with sharp eyes and a voice that could cut glass. Even she said nothing. $1, Curtis repeated, as if daring someone to speak. Tom raised his hand almost absently. He didn't need more land. What he needed was distraction, a reason to wake up, to mend something that wasn't just another stranger's. "Tractor. $1 bid," Curtis said quickly. "Any other offers?" The silence thickened. He waited a long moment, then slammed the gavel down. "Sold to Mr. Walker for $1. As Tom signed the papers, Earl approached him, his face pale. "Tom," he said in a low voice, "you don't want that place." Tom looked up. "It's just a cabin, Earl." "Ain't just a cabin," the old man muttered. "It's Birch Hollow. Folks don't go near it no more. Not since the fire, and—" He stopped himself, glanced toward Curtis, then shook his head. "Just be careful." Tom wanted to laugh it off, but something in Earl's eyes made him hesitate. Fear. Real fear. Still, Tom had long stopped letting other people's superstitions run his life. He tucked the deed into his coat pocket, nodded politely, and left without another word. By afternoon, he and Max were on the dirt road that wound toward Birch Hollow. The path narrowed as they rode, hemmed in by pines that leaned close as though whispering to each other. The snow had begun to melt, leaving the air thick with the scent of wet earth and moss. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, Tom pulled his truck to a stop and stared. It was smaller than he expected. 1 story, built from darkened logs, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of neglect. The porch leaned to one side, and one of the shutters hung loose, creaking softly in the wind. Yet, for all its wear, there was something almost inviting about it, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. He stepped out, crunching through the frosted grass, and Max leapt from the passenger seat, tail stiff, ears up. The dog sniffed the air, then gave a low growl. "Easy," Tom murmured, running a hand through the coarse fur behind Max's neck. The door creaked open at the lightest touch. Inside, the air was cold and dry, filled with the smell of dust and old pine. A shaft of light cut through a crack in the shutter, illuminating particles that danced lazily in the air. There was a stone fireplace against the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, and a rusty kettle on the stove that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Tom felt something stir inside him. A strange mix of unease and belonging. He'd expected decay, emptiness, but instead there was order. The chairs were neatly tucked in, a threadbare rug lay centered on the floor, and the shelves, though dusty, were lined with jars still sealed tight. Someone had cared for this place once, maybe even recently. He ran his hand along the wall, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingertips, and tried to imagine the lives that had passed here. Then Max barked, sharp, urgent. Tom spun. The dog stood at the base of the narrow staircase leading to the attic, hackles raised. He barked again, staring upward, ears rigid. Tom frowned. "What is it, boy?" The attic door was closed, the latch rusted but faintly scratched, as if recently, disturbed. Tom's pulse quickened. He climbed the first step, each creak of the wood echoing like a warning. Max stayed below, whining low in his throat. Halfway up, Tom paused, his hand brushing something on the banister, a dark smear that looked too much like dried blood. He froze. The air seemed to thicken around him. For the first time in years, Tom Walker felt truly afraid, not of ghosts or curses, but of the quiet certainty that he wasn't supposed to be here. He turned to look at Max, whose eyes gleamed in the half-light like twin embers. "It's just a house," Tom whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. But when he reached the attic door and laid his hand on the handle, it turned far too easily, as if someone had oiled it recently. The door creaked open an inch, and from within, something metallic clattered softly against the floorboards. Tom froze, staring into the darkness above, his breath caught between disbelief and dread. Something, or someone, was already in the cabin. Chapter 2. The Woman in the Photograph. The morning after the attic discovery dawned gray and windless, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Tom Walker hadn't slept. He'd sat most of the night in a creaky chair beside the fireplace, the dying embers casting faint red light across the room. The noise from the attic, metal clattering against wood, hadn't repeated, but its echo lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. Max had refused to leave his side, occasionally lifting his head to sniff at the air, ears twitching at sounds Tom couldn't hear. By dawn, the man's exhaustion had settled into a kind of numb determination. He was done being afraid of ghosts, real or imagined. He climbed to the attic again once daylight filled the cracks in the walls. The room smelled of cedar and dust. Broken boxes lay scattered, their contents long decayed. Yellowed letters, a child's shoe, an empty whiskey bottle. Near the corner, a tin photo frame had fallen face down. When Tom turned it over, his breath caught. Inside was a photograph, sepia, faded but clear enough to see a young woman standing in front of the very same cabin. She wore a long white dress that looked hand-sewn, and her hair, dark and soft, was tied with a ribbon at her nape. Her face wasn't beautiful in the polished sense, but there was something disarmingly kind in her eyes, a warmth that reached through decades of dust. On the back of the photo, written in elegant script, were the words, "To Edward, come back to me. L." Tom stared at the name, running a thumb over the ink as if touch could summon memory. Edward. He didn't know any Edward, but the tone of that message, the longing it carried, it stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt since Helen died. Love, or the ghost of it. He placed the photograph on the table downstairs, beside a mug of coffee gone cold. Outside, the snow had begun to melt into thin streams, glistening beneath the pine shadows. It was nearly noon when he heard the knock at the door. 3 polite raps, careful but firm. Tom opened it to find a woman standing on the porch. She was in her mid-50s, perhaps a few years younger than him, dressed in a heavy wool coat and a knitted scarf the color of dry lavender. Her figure was lean but graceful, her posture upright in a way that spoke of quiet dignity. She had shoulder-length auburn hair streaked with silver, skin pale from the long Montana winters, and eyes the color of storm clouds, soft, intelligent, and wary. "I'm sorry to intrude," she began, her voice low and calm, though Tom caught the quiver of hesitation beneath it. "You must be the new owner of this place." "That's right," Tom said, glancing behind her. No car on the road, just footprints leading from the path. "Can I help you with something?" "My name's Sarah Collins," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I work at the town library. I heard someone finally bought this cabin. It used to belong to my brother, Edward Collins. He disappeared 15 years ago." Her words hung heavy in the air. Tom felt the photograph upstairs pull at the back of his mind like a magnet. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Sarah nodded once, her face tightening with controlled grief. "Most people around here pretend not to remember. They say Edward left town, but I know he didn't. This house was his life. He built it himself after he came back from the war. I used to visit him every Sunday, until one day—" She trailed off, staring past Tom into the shadows of the cabin. Max padded forward then, sniffing her boots before sitting down with an almost deliberate calm. Then he wagged his tail, just once, and gave a low bark, not of warning, but recognition. Sarah's eyes softened. "You've got a fine shepherd," she said, kneeling slightly to scratch behind his ears. "I used to have one too, looked just like this fellow." Tom watched the scene with something like awe. Max wasn't a dog who trusted easily. He had been protective, sometimes wary of strangers, yet now he leaned into Sarah's touch as though greeting an old friend. "That's strange," Tom murmured. "He's usually not this friendly." "Animals remember things we forget," Sarah said with a faint smile. "Or maybe they see what we can't." They sat for a while in front of the fire, as Sarah explained what little she knew. Edward had been a carpenter, known for his kindness and stubborn honesty. After returning from overseas, he'd built the cabin as a refuge, a place, she said, where the noise of the world couldn't reach him anymore. But one night, after a storm, neighbors found his horse wandering loose on the road, saddle still strapped on, riderless. The sheriff searched the woods for weeks, but found nothing. Some said he'd run off. Others whispered the land was cursed. Sarah, however, never believed he'd left willingly. "He loved this place too much," she said softly. "He wouldn't have just walked away." Tom listened, eyes on the fire. The weight of her words sank into him like cold water. He wanted to tell her about the attic, about the photo, but something held him back. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, that fragile hope she still carried. Or maybe he wasn't ready to share what he had found. Not yet. Instead, he said, "I was cleaning upstairs this morning. The place feels untouched, like time stopped when he left." Sarah nodded slowly. "It tends to hold on to memories. Maybe that's why no one else wanted it." As the afternoon light faded, Sarah stood to leave. "I brought you some books," she said, handing him a small stack wrapped in twine. "You look like the kind of man who reads more than he admits." Tom chuckled quietly. "I used to, not so much lately." "Well," she said, meeting his gaze, "maybe this house is giving you a second chance." When she stepped outside, Max followed her to the gate before returning reluctantly. Tom stood by the window watching her walk down the trail, her coat a small patch of color against the snow. Something about her presence lingered even after she was gone, a scent of lavender and old paper, the sound of kindness. He turned back toward the table, his eyes falling on the photograph again. But now, in the dimming light, he noticed something he hadn't before. The edges of the photo were slightly curled, as if exposed to heat. And beneath the inked words on the back, faint but visible, another line appeared in smudged pencil. "They're watching. Don't trust the one who smiles." The fire hissed softly in the hearth. Outside, Max growled low at something unseen among the trees. Tom picked up the photograph, his pulse tightening in his throat. For the first time, he wondered whether Sarah's visit had been coincidence or warning. Chapter 3: The Secret Beneath the Floor. The wind outside howled like a restless spirit that morning, rattling the shutters and moaning through the cracks of the cabin walls. Tom Walker crouched near the fireplace, feeding it bits of dry kindling, trying to drive the chill from his bones. Max lay stretched beside him, his thick fur glinting amber in the firelight, ears flicking at every sound. The night before had been long and uneasy. The photograph still sat on the table, that haunting scrawl, "They're watching. Don't trust the one who smiles," burned into Tom's mind. He hadn't told Sarah about it. Something about her story, about Edward's disappearance, had felt sincere, and yet something else lingered under her calm exterior, a kind of quiet sorrow that might also have been fear. Max suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. His nose pointed toward the corner of the living room, where one floorboard sat slightly raised, the edge splintered as if pried up once before. Tom frowned. "What is it, boy?" The dog stood, tail stiff, and tapped the edge of the board with his paw, whining softly. Tom fetched a screwdriver from his toolbox and knelt beside it. The board was oddly loose, far too easy to lift for something that hadn't been touched in years. Beneath it lay darkness and the faint scent of earth. His fingers brushed metal. He pulled up a small tin box, the lid rusted but intact. Inside were folded letters, a handful of photographs, and a bundle of yellowed papers tied with string. Tom carried it to the table. Max stayed close, nose twitching. The first envelope he opened was addressed to Edward Collins, stamped from 1949. The letter inside was written in hurried, uneven script. "Edward, I've done what you asked. The papers prove it. Hale's been buying up land under false deeds, paying off the assessor. If anyone finds out, we're dead. Burn this after reading. L." Tom's pulse quickened. He rifled through the rest, property deeds, maps, receipts. Together, they painted a damning picture. A man named Richard Hale, a wealthy ranch owner who controlled half the valley, had forged land titles and bribed officials to claim the rest. Edward must have discovered it, and it had gotten him killed. The name Hale wasn't unfamiliar. Everyone in Birch Hollow knew him, or rather knew of him. Hale was in his early 60s now, tall, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, and sharp-eyed, with the polished charm of a man used to winning. He owned the largest ranch for 50 miles, employed dozens, and sponsored every town fair. But Tom had always thought there was something too smooth about him. He smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. Tom shoved the papers back into the box just as a knock echoed through the cabin. He froze. It wasn't Sarah. She always knocked lightly. This was heavy, deliberate. Max bristled, stepping between Tom and the door. "Easy," Tom whispered, reaching for the old hunting rifle by the fireplace. He opened the door halfway. A man stood there, lean, unshaven, in a brown coat dusted with mud. His face was narrow, jaw rough with stubble, eyes pale and sharp. "Morning," the stranger said, voice low and measured. "You Tom Walker? Depends who's asking." The man tilted his head, revealing a faint scar running from his temple to his jawline. "Name's Fletcher. Work for Mr. Hale. He heard you bought this cabin. Thought I'd come by, make you an offer." Tom's gut tightened. "I'm not selling." Fletcher smiled thinly, the kind of smile that didn't belong on a friendly man. "You might want to reconsider. Mr. Hale's sentimental about this place. His father used to own it before some things got complicated." "I'm sure they did," Tom said evenly. "Still not selling." Fletcher's eyes flicked past him into the room. "That's so? Shame? A lot of bad luck comes with stubbornness." Max growled deep in his throat. Fletcher's smile faltered. "Nice dog," he muttered. "He doesn't like uninvited guests," Tom said, voice cold. Fletcher nodded slowly, tugged his hat lower, and turned back toward the woods. "You take care, Mr. Walker," he called. "Strange things happen in old houses." When he was gone, Tom closed the door and exhaled hard. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the certainty that whatever he'd found under that floorboard was dangerous. That afternoon, Sarah returned. She wore a green wool coat this time, cheeks flushed from the wind. "Tom," she said breathlessly, "I saw someone watching the road near the library, a man in a brown coat. He left when he saw me." Tom hesitated, then told her everything. The box, the letters, the name Hale. Sarah's eyes widened. "Hale?" she whispered. "He and Edward were business partners once, but Edward accused him of cheating the settlers, taking land that wasn't his. Hale denied everything. A week later, Edward vanished." Before Tom could reply, Max barked sharply, spinning toward the window. A dark figure moved outside, then a crash of glass shattered the silence. Tom dropped behind the table as a shadow burst through the window. Fletcher. He lunged, knife flashing. Max met him midair, teeth sinking into his arm. The two struggled, the dog snarling, the man cursing. Tom grabbed the rifle, cocked it, and shouted, "Get out!" Fletcher staggered back, bleeding, and stumbled through the open door into the snow, disappearing into the trees. The cabin fell silent, but for Max's heavy panting. Tom knelt beside him. Blood streaked the dog's shoulder, a shallow cut, not deep, but enough to sting. Easy, boy. You did good. Max licked his hand, tail thumping weakly. Sarah fetched a towel from the kitchen, her hands trembling as she pressed it against the wound. He's going to come back, she said quietly. They won't stop now. Tom looked at the warm metal box on the table, its secrets spilling out like ghosts. Then we find out what Edward died for, he said, and we finish what he started. Outside, the sun dipped behind the ridge, casting the cabin in amber shadow. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, sharp and lonely. Tom closed the floorboard over the box, but in his gut he knew, burying it wouldn't be enough this time. Chapter 4. Fire in the Night. The wind had turned cruel that evening, howling through the pine trees like an animal in pain. The air carried a strange scent, smoke and sap, and it made Tom Walker's skin prickle before he even saw the glow on the horizon. Inside the cabin, the fire in the hearth had long gone to embers, but the warmth lingered between him, Sarah, and Max, who lay curled at their feet, his fur rising and falling, with the slow rhythm of uneasy sleep. Tom sat hunched over the table, studying the papers from the metal box once more. His eyes traced Edward's handwriting, steady even in fear, while Sarah quietly mended Max's bandage. She had taken off her coat, revealing a light blue sweater that softened the hard lines of worry around her face. Her auburn hair fell loosely over her shoulders, catching the flicker of firelight. There was strength in her, quiet, steady, the kind that comes from surviving heartbreak without letting it turn her bitter. "You don't have to do this," she said, voice gentle but firm. "You could burn them and walk away." Tom shook his head. Edward didn't die for nothing. If Hale's behind all this, people deserve to know. Sarah lowered her gaze. "You sound just like him," she whispered. Outside, Max's ears twitched. He lifted his head and gave a low growl, one paw twitching as if sensing danger in his dreams. Tom reached down to calm him, but then he smelled it too. Smoke, not from the hearth. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. Sarah frowned. "What is it?" Tom crossed to the window. The world outside flickered orange. His heart lurched. Flames danced along the porch, crawling up the wooden beams. "The cabin's on fire!" In seconds, the room filled with smoke. The air turned thick, the kind that burned the throat and made every breath a battle. Max barked wildly, circling them, as Tom grabbed Sarah's arm. The papers, they were still on the table, but there was no time. The flames reached the roof, roaring like a beast freed from its cage. Tom yanked Sarah toward the back door, but the exit was already engulfed. "Out the window!" he shouted. He smashed the glass with his elbow, ignoring the pain. Sarah climbed through first, her face streaked with soot. Max followed, leaping through the smoke like a shadow. Tom crawled out last, coughing hard, his jacket catching fire at the sleeve. He tore it off, stamping the flames under his boot. They stumbled into the freezing night, choking on air that smelled of burning pine and fear. Behind them, the cabin crackled, collapsing in on itself. For a moment, Tom just stood there, staring at the ruins of the only home he'd begun to care for since Helen's death. "It's gone," Sarah said softly. Her voice trembled not from the cold, but from shock. Max whined, pressing against Tom's leg. Then, through the smoke, a beam of light cut across the darkness. A car engine idled nearby. Figure emerged, tall and broad-shouldered, his silhouette solid against the flickering blues. "Walker!" the man shouted. His voice carried authority, deep, steady, the voice of someone used to being obeyed. He stepped closer, and the firelight revealed a rugged face lined with years and duty. His hair was steel gray, his jaw square, and his dark eyes sharp beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Sheriff Henry Dalton," he said, flashing a badge that glinted like silver fire. "You two need to move, now." Tom hesitated, chest heaving. "How do you know my name?" Henry's gaze hardened. "Because I knew Edward Collins, and I've been waiting 15 years for someone to dig up what he found." They followed him to a black truck parked down the dirt road. Inside, Henry's demeanor was all precision and control. He was in his late 50s, tall, fit despite his age, his voice steady as granite. Yet there was a heaviness to him, too, a man shaped by regret. His right hand trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. "I was Edward's friend," he said as he drove. "We were partners once, military police back in the service. He trusted me. After he found out about Hale's land schemes, he brought me the evidence. Told me he was going to the county office the next day to turn it in. I told him I'd meet him there." His jaw tightened. He never showed. The next morning they found his horse wandering the ridge. I looked for him for months, but Hale's men had already buried the truth. Sarah's hand covered her mouth. You think Hale killed him? I know he did, Henry said flatly. And tonight's fire proves he's getting desperate. Tom clenched his fists. We've still got the evidence. I hid it in the woods before we ran. Henry nodded approvingly. Then we have one shot. We get those papers to the courthouse by dawn. But Hale had other plans. They hadn't been on the road 10 minutes before the truck's headlights caught movement ahead. 3 figures standing in the middle of the dirt road, rifles glinting under the moonlight. Henry cursed, jerking the wheel as bullets shattered the windshield. The truck skidded sideways into the trees. Out, he barked. Go! They spilled into the forest, the night alive with gunfire. Max bounded ahead, ears pinned back, his growls slicing through the chaos. Tom pulled Sarah down behind a fallen log. Henry crouched beside them, drawing his revolver with practiced precision. Hale's men, he hissed. They won't stop. A shot rang out, splintering bark inches from Tom's head. Max darted toward the sound, teeth bared. Max, no! Tom shouted, but the dog was already gone. A scream cut through the dark, followed by silence. Then Max reappeared, limping, blood on his shoulder, but alive. He'd driven them back. In the confusion, Sarah pulled something from her pocket, the old photograph. Its surface gleamed faintly under the moonlight. Tom, she whispered, look at this. On the back, where the faint warning had been, more words had appeared beneath the soot. Show them the face that smiles. Tom's heart froze. The photograph wasn't just sentimental, it was proof. Edward must have hidden the connection in plain sight. Hale, he breathed. He's in the picture. Look. Behind her, in the reflection of the window. Henry took the photo, his face pale in the moonlight. This is enough. This is what we needed. The sound of sirens broke through the night air, distant, growing louder. Henry stood, firing 2 warning shots into the air. Over here, he shouted. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees as the sheriff's deputies arrived. The gunmen fled, vanishing like ghosts into the woods. When dawn finally broke, the smoke from the burned cabin rose like a scar against the morning sky. Richard Hale was led away in handcuffs, his perfect hair disheveled, his smile gone at last. Tom watched silently, Max resting against his leg, Sarah beside him. Her hand brushed his, and this time, neither of them pulled away. The forest was quiet again, but this time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Chapter 5. A Home Made of Light. A year had passed since the fire, and Montana had shed its scars beneath the tender touch of spring, then summer, and finally the soft descent into winter once more. The air now smelled of pine and promise. The cabin, rebuilt on its old foundation, stood proud again, not as a place of ghosts, but of healing. The wood was new, pale and strong, and the porch caught the morning sun like an open hand. A sign hung above the gate, Edward's Haven, letters carved deep into oak, polished until they gleamed. Tom Walker stood on the porch, a mug of steaming coffee in his weathered hands. His hair had gone grayer over the year, though his shoulders were still broad and steady. There were more lines around his eyes now, but they were the good kind, the kind that came from laughter, not pain. He wore an old flannel shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing arms still marked with faint scars from that terrible night. A light breeze stirred the scent of hay and wet earth from the nearby kennels. Below the porch, Sarah was tending to a small garden of wildflowers. She wore a straw hat that shaded her fair skin, and her auburn hair shone like copper where the sunlight broke through. There was something graceful about the way she moved, quiet, careful, but sure. Over the year, she had transformed too. The sorrow in her eyes had softened into contentment. Every so often, she would look up toward Tom, and their gazes would meet with a silent understanding. They had survived, and they had built something worth living for. Max, their loyal German shepherd, was older now. His muzzle had silvered, and his movements were slower, but his eyes remained sharp and full of warmth. He often spent his afternoons lying beneath the old pine tree near the fence, keeping watch over the fields and the dogs they had rescued. There were 7 of them now, each with a name, a story, and a second chance. Tom liked to think Edward would have approved. The rescue had started as Sarah's idea. He saved us, she had said, resting her hand on Max's fur one morning. Maybe it's time we save a few others. And so they did. Together they built kennels, fences, and a small barn. They opened their doors to strays and abandoned dogs from the neighboring towns, working with Henry Dalton, still sheriff, though he had begun talking about retirement, to rehome them. Henry visited often, his once stern face softening each time Max limped out to greet him. He'd never forgiven himself for not saving Edward, but Tom could see peace settling in the old lawman's heart. That morning, Henry had dropped by with paperwork for the shelter's registration. He looked much the same, tall, solid, with graying hair under his wide-brimmed hat, but his gait had slowed, and he now carried a small limp from an old injury he refused to explain. Over coffee, he had smiled at Tom. "You know," he'd said, "for a man who once hated paperwork, you sure signed yourself into a lot of it." Tom had laughed, a deep sound that felt good in his chest. "Better this kind of paperwork than arrest records." Henry chuckled. "Fair point." He tipped his hat toward the sign over the gate. "Edward would have liked this. You did right by him." When Henry left, Sarah joined Tom on the porch. The late afternoon light painted her face gold, and she leaned against the railing beside him, close enough for their shoulders to touch. "He's right," she said softly. "Edward would be proud." Tom nodded, his gaze drifting across the open fields. "I think about him sometimes. About that last letter he wrote. He wasn't fighting for land, not really. He was fighting for what's right." He took her hand, roughened by work, but warm. "I get it now." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the rustle of wind through pine needles. Max barked once from his spot beneath the tree, as if agreeing. That night, the first snow of winter arrived, soft as forgiveness. It came silently, drifting over the rebuilt roof, the kennels, the old fence line. Inside, the fire glowed steady in the hearth. Sarah sat on the couch, mending a dog blanket, while Tom poured 2 mugs of cocoa. Max lay at their feet, his head resting between his paws, tail giving an occasional thump. "Do you ever think," Sarah said, looking toward the window where snowflakes danced, "that everything we went through, Edward, the fire, hail, it was meant to lead here?" Tom smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe life just gives you second chances when you stop running from the first ones." She laughed quietly. "That sounds like something my brother would have said." He turned toward her, eyes full of gentle affection. "Your brother was a good man. I hope I've done right by him." "You have," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You both have." Outside, the snow thickened, blanketing the ground in silence. The sign that read Edward's Haven gleamed under the porch light, the words shimmering with frost. Tom looked down at Max, whose breathing had grown slow and even. He reached out, scratching the dog's ears. "You found us a home, didn't you, boy?" Max gave a sleepy grunt in reply. Later, when the last logs in the fire turned to glowing coals, Tom and Sarah stood by the window, watching the snow fall. The world was hushed, wrapped in silver and peace. Tom's voice broke the silence, deep and thoughtful. $1 for a house," he said, smiling, "but a lifetime to find a family." Sarah's fingers intertwined with his. "Worth every penny," she whispered. Max lifted his head, gave a soft bark, then lay back down with a sigh that sounded almost like contentment. And as the first dawn of winter touched the horizon, light spilling gently across the cabin's windows, it felt as if the ghosts had finally gone home. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles wrapped in light. He sends them on 4 legs, with kind eyes and a loyal heart. Tom thought he had bought an old cabin for $1 lonely, but what he truly found was grace, the kind that rebuilds a man's soul. Maybe the real miracles aren't the ones that split the heavens, but the quiet ones that find us when we've stopped looking. A loyal dog, a broken man, a forgotten home. And somehow, through it all, love found its way back. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories of faith, love, and second chances. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may His quiet miracles find their way to your doorstep, just as they did for Tom, Sarah, and Max.